So if you're like me, I'm sure at some point you've come across a building like this and wondered to yourself, look, this is, banks are businesses whose sole purpose is to make money from money, right? And they hire MBAs and economists galore, and look how much money they spend on huge, expensive buildings, right? With, and these are large, imposing buildings, money that could have been spent on, let's say, profits, dividends, salaries. Preferably, these are buildings with large Roman columns at the entrance. They're made of brick or stone, and they have fancy decor, and they scream of gold. They have large lobbies, again, preferably with Roman columns. And the interesting thing is, you find this not just in the big cities, you'll find this in small towns too. As someone who grew up in a very small town, I'll tell you that the banks were always like this. And it's an interesting question why such an economic beast, a purely financial beast, spends so much on its resources on this. For those of us who delve in game theory, we look at this and we say, this is what you call a costly signal. So what the heck are they signaling? And the answer is, the biggest threat to the banking industry is a bank run. Banks, by definition of their business, do not keep all their money on hand. They run on the premise that not everyone is going to show up at the same day asking to withdraw their deposits. If they did, the banks, even the most solid, financially solvent banks, would fold within a day. So the question then is, in fact, this phenomenon is so powerful that we have examples in history where even rumors, misplaced rumors, are enough to sink a bank. So then, of course, you've got to be asking by about this point, what on earth does this have to do with nonproliferation, the NPT? And the answer, I think, is, so if you look at the Middle East in 2005, right, the blue states are those supposedly with a nuclear program, and by foreign sources, of course, and then there's Iran. What you see within 11 months is 14 countries start making declarations about how they want to have a nuclear, civilian nuclear program. Now, when they made these announcements, they generally justified this need on economic reasons, energy, the growing energy use. The problem I have is that if that was truly the reason, the motivation behind these programs, it's difficult to explain why they all moved at roughly the same time. So the point of the first point of the talk I'd like to make is, one, that the key challenge for the NPT is going to be to prevent a bank run on the institution. And in other words, what I mean is that many countries may lose their core confidence in the NPT's ability to prevent cheating on the document, and so that they will also pursue some sort of a nuclear program. Leveraging that metaphor, then, of course, you want to think about, well, how exactly do you prevent that outcome, which is the title of our panel. And finally, because it's later in the afternoon and the food's all in your stomach, I don't want you to work too hard. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, or towards the end, where this metaphor that I've built here falls flat, where it fails to actually capture what we're talking about, and then offer some thoughts about who may be bluffing, who of these 14 states may be bluffing, and who may be truly intent on proliferating. So in the 1920s and 30s, bank failures were extraordinarily common. By 1933, there were about 4,000 in a year. And bank runs were especially common. However, today, bank runs are especially rare. And I'll give you a personal anecdote. I used to be a customer of Washington Mutual, and I was living in California at the time. And Washington Mutual went under in September 2008. I didn't run to the bank. In fact, no one I knew who was a customer ran to the bank. And why not? The answer is the FDIC. Almost 80 years ago, well, next month in March, it will be 80 years ago that Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And it's an independent body which really changes the calculus of the actors. First and foremost, it means that you no longer fear losing everything if others cheat on the institution, cheat in parentheses, and verifies, it gives some sort of information about how that institution is doing, how the bank is doing. If we take a second now and we think more generally about this phenomenon, we try to create what's called a model. The key element here is that you have an institution that's called a bank, the NPT, could be other things as well, but it's a type of institution that can only work if all the members trust that the vast majority, maybe not perhaps all members, but the vast, vast majority also won't cheat. In game theory, we'd call this defecting. If we thought that the others would cheat, then upholding the obligation becomes especially costly, and you'd be likely to lose out. Essentially, this is a prisoner's dilemma. You could also call it a stag hunt. The bank run is really, if you're into this, more like a stag hunt, but it essentially works the same as far as we care for this purpose. And a bank run is essentially this, that actors are losing faith in institutions' ability to perform these core functions, right? And what's really interesting about bank runs is that even if the institution was in fact solvent before, just the herd heading for the door makes the institution crash. Now, how relevant is this actually to what we're talking about? So this is a dossier from the IISS in 2008, and I'll just share with you, especially that red part, that if any one of Iran's neighbors, they say, were to seek to acquire nuclear weapons in response to Iran's nuclear program, this would put additional pressure on others to do the same. And as you see in the red, the momentum in this direction could continue even if the Iranian nuclear crisis were resolved. And that, I think, is the key part of what I'd like to underline here. And in fact, there is indeed some sort of a precedent for all this. If you look at missile proliferation, right, the Saudis acquired missiles from Pakistan in the late 80s in response really to the growing programs in Iraq and Iran. And it didn't end with the Saudis, right? The Emiratis also acquired Pakistani missiles later on. Josh Pollack has a nice article on this in the Nonproliferation Review. So the question then is, how on earth do you prevent a bank run? So let me suggest that there are three core things that you have to strive for. One is that to ensure that no one cheats. One is you provide disincentives for cheating, right? And these have to be in particular strong. Second, that you provide some sort of insurance for cooperation. In other words, even if you continue to adhere to your commitment, knowing full well that others may not, you know that you're safe. Sort of insurance policy. And third, you have to make it difficult to cheat by surprise. In other words, it's not that you can necessarily prevent cheating, but simply that people would get forewarning about the potential of someone cheating makes it so the institution can work. So then if we're thinking in terms of the NPT, who can serve as the FDIC? Who can be this overarching body? And I'd like to suggest actually that the United States and Professor Avron spoke a little bit yesterday about multipolarity and bipolarity, unipolarity, and I can get into later why the U.S. But for right now, just take it as an assumption that the U.S. is really the only capable actor whose interests are aligned with playing the role of guarantor of the NPT. So how exactly then does it make cheating more costly? How does it punish cheaters? I'd like to take a step back and look at this remark from Ambassador Gregory Schulte, the former U.S. ambassador to the IAEA. And he suggested, which is interesting, that another round of sanctions or talks is unlikely to change Iran or North Korea's calculus. Rather than fixating on the proliferation they are unable to prevent, concerned countries should pay more attention to preventing proliferation to states that have not yet decided to build nuclear weapons, particularly in the Middle East. Now, the problem I have with this is that the cost imposed on Iran and North Korea, regardless of whether or not you can actually stop these countries' programs or roll them back in the case of North Korea, it's not just about them. You are sending a signal to all future potential proliferators. In other words, the importance of sanctioning Iran harshly and North Korea harshly is not just about their programs, and it's important to keep this in mind because the degree to which the sanctions are crushing, the degree to which the military strikes, if indeed it has to come to that, happen, it actually makes it so you don't have to do this in the future against additional states. The more credible that threat, the more costly it is to everyone else, the less you have to do it. And this, in a sense, bolsters deterrence. In terms of providing better insurance to those who commit to cooperation, even in the threat of what we again call defection or cheating by those who continue, by those in the treaty, I think what's going to be necessary at this point is an unmistakable commitment, in particular by the U.S., for a defense pact for those countries who maintain adherence to the NPT and are in good standing. And I don't mean just a nuclear umbrella. I mean a defense pact against any attempt to change it, to infringe on the territorial integrity of one of these countries who are threatened by, in particular, Iran or North Korea. Simple statements to this effect are going to be insufficient. And here I have to agree with what Bruno said last night. His point at the very end was right on. that if Iran succeeds in getting a nuclear weapon, in particular if the U.S. does not use force to stop it, despite repeated American public commitments that it would stop an Iranian nuclear program, then you have to ask, what does this do for the credibility of that, the credibility that really underwrites the insurance I'm talking about here? And this goes back to my critique of Schulte, that future proliferation is going to depend on what states do now. And so it's not that you can just kind of move the focus away from North Korea and Iran. The focus must be on North Korea and Iran. A formal treaty would be a better sort of insurance policy, as Professor Evran has pointed out in his article, Nonproliferation Review. No country in the Middle East, as of today, has a formal treaty with the United States, a formal security guarantee. Now, why on earth would a formal treaty be any better? And the answer in the general international relations literature would be what we call reputation costs. That having it in a big written document and then not living up to it would somehow impugn your reputation in the future, and that would hurt you. But perhaps the best sort of guarantee, and this of course comes right out of Thomas Schelling, and that is the idea of having a concrete U.S. presence. It could be very, very, very small, right? You don't need to have a lot of U.S. soldiers, but just enough so that it makes it so the U.S. must react to any sort of attack on that country. Now, there are, of course, costs to having any sort of U.S., let's call it boots on the ground in any of these countries. In the Khobar Towers, it was a perfect example of the sort of costs that you have to deal with. Now, in one last point on this issue, and that is that the U.S. talk about a pivot to East Asia, and we heard this again mentioned this morning, I think it was a terrible mistake. Why so? Again, I want to remind you what's important here are those columns. It's that gold. It's ensuring that you have full, credible commitment to maintaining your interest here. If ever people in the region, in the Gulf region, start thinking that they aren't critical to the U.S. strategic interest, then what does this say about their commitment in the future to their security? And finally, to improve verification, to make it difficult to cheat by surprise. Surprises, obviously, like Syria in 2007, Libya, Natanz, these are, of course, a huge threat to the NPT. On an aside, you might suggest that the destruction of the Syrian reactor was a boon for the NPT. But I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here. That 2008 dossier that I mentioned has a large laundry list of potential ways to improve the verification scheme of the NPT. So what I'm going to do now is talk to you a little bit about where my metaphor falls flat. In a bank run, no one has an incentive to bluff. Because in nuclear proliferation the process is slow-moving, because there is a possibility of having the U.S. intervene more strongly or less strongly in Iran, there is an incentive to feign interest in a nuclear program, right? And so how do we know whether or not this is real or bluffing? In game theory, we talk about, in response to Iranian threats, all of these states should be anticipated to make what we call cheap talk comments, public statements saying, yes, we're also interested in a civilian nuclear program. Why? Because everyone would like to pressure the U.S. into action. And so even if you're bluffing, it's worth doing. And because the cost of reneging on that is nil. And how do I demonstrate this? Think about Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, who all in 2006 made statements to this effect and then did not follow up on it. Their bluff was called, essentially. And ask yourselves, did they pay a serious cost? Did the leaders pay a cost? Did the countries pay a cost? And I don't see a cost that they paid. In which case, any statement made, and I want to make this point very clear for those who make arguments one way or the other about this issue, any statement made or document leaked, in my mind, doesn't actually constitute proof about true intention of a given country, because you have an incentive to misrepresent what only you know. You have an incentive to bluff. So this becomes again, in what game theory we'd call a classic game of signaling, right? And so the question then is, how does a country like Saudi Arabia, for instance, how would they signal that they aren't just bluffing and that they're actually serious, that they would have a nuclear program of one sort or another? Well, the first thing they could do is invest large sums of money, right? You could build infrastructure. Not just declare that you're going to invest money, but actually spend the money. I'd like to suggest, however, that that is not necessarily a good signal. Why? So you probably are mostly aware with this idea of weakness as strength in bargaining, right? It's a classic idea that being weak is actually sometimes really good when you're bargaining. Having someone that you have to report to actually makes your bargaining position stronger. I use this with my wife all the time. Because she makes the decisions, I get better deals. The truth here is that because Saudi Arabia is strong economically, because they, $1 billion, let's put it this way, is chump change for the Saudis, it's not actually a costly signal, right? It's not a truly costly signal. A diplomatic price that they might pay, for instance, as they've done, refusing to give up the right to enrich uranium, that might be a better signal. But in my mind, actually what would be a really good signal is to look at their weakness. What is the Saudis' weakness? Their technological standing, right? Their lack of technological infrastructure. So that if you watch them invest in developing a cadre of technically competent people in this field, that is a credible signal that they're not just bluffing, right? And I don't mean care, I mean send people abroad. If you start seeing them send hundreds of people abroad to get competence in nuclear physics, then this is a truly costly signal. There is this alternative that you see mentioned frequently, the idea that the Saudis could buy a nuclear weapon, right? They wouldn't have to necessarily build one, they could buy it. The problem, of course, in this context is it's a very poor signal. Why? Because it's very, a nuclear program, an indigenous one, it's big, it's expensive, it's slow, and that allows for signaling and bargaining. And if the point of this is to press the Americans to stop Iran, not because you necessarily want the weapon, but because you want to push the U.S. to stop Iran, then secret purchases of weapons are very difficult to credibly demonstrate. You could be bluffing about it. And in a certain sense, I'd also suggest that it also contributes less to nuclear deterrence. In a certain sense, because you have a problem credibly telling people that you've got this weapon, it reminds us of Dr. Strangelove. As of course, everyone here has to be a fan of Dr. Strangelove. The whole point of a doomsday machine is lost if you keep it secret. And the problem, again, with buying a nuclear weapon, just as they bought the medium-range missiles, it's difficult to know whether they actually have it or not. Again, because you have an incentive to either to say you don't or to say you do, but to misrepresent what you actually have. So finally, like many costly signals, these also serve as hedges. And this has been mentioned. I'm not going to get into it more, just to say that it does reduce the cost of having to follow through with your threat. Let me conclude with a final thought. So in the social sciences today, social science tends to focus on not rules, but under what conditions will a rule take place. So under what conditions can you see a certain outcome? And our question, of course, is who would bluff? So under what conditions should we expect countries to bluff? I'd like to suggest that it really depends on two things: the motivation and the vulnerability to enforcement by the international community. And what do I mean by this? Again, I'd like to keep it somewhat simple. If we look at just motivation, there are lots that are mentioned, but I think we can really boil it down to two. One, the fear of external invasion, and that this would guarantee your security. It doesn't help you necessarily in terms of domestic unrest, but in terms of external intervention, sure. And second, regional influence. Now, the problem here is that if the costs of cheating on the NPT and developing a nuclear weapon are sufficiently high, right, the imposition of sanctions, a military strike, if it's sufficiently high, then the idea that you would pursue nuclear weapons in order solely or primarily to gain regional influence is insufficient. It isn't really a motivating factor, okay? In other words, first of all, because these things are very costly, not every country, just to gain a little more regional influence, is willing to have its citizens look like the North Koreans, right? Not everyone, even as far as the Iranian, average Iranian citizen is concerned. But much more importantly, harsh sanctions leave fewer resources for exporting influence, less money. It reduces your trade, which is extraordinarily important in terms of regional influence. It reduces your conventional military capacity. Look at Iraq in the 1990s under sanctions. And it makes you diplomatically isolated. All these are key tools for gaining regional influence. Add to this that once you actually have nuclear weapons, as the United States found out very quickly, they aren't nearly as useful as you'd think. They're difficult to use in crisis situations, and they're even difficult to leverage in crisis situations. They're much more difficult and unwieldy than you might think. And so the conclusion is you could actually end up with less regional influence than you started out with. Again, I suggested, however, that there are two things. One is the vulnerability to international enforcement. I'd like to look at two countries that people mention all the time and flush this out. One is Turkey and the other is Saudi Arabia. So in terms of vulnerability, if we look at Turkey, I don't think that Turkey could stand the cost of international enforcement. Just started with its economy, which is 50% of which is trade. To cut Turkey off from the international community in terms of a massive trade embargo would be devastating for the country. And unlike North Korea, which really has little to offer in international trade, Turkey has quite a bit. Its economy runs on it. Not to mention that it has this insurance policy I mentioned before, which is NATO, right? Now, if you look at Saudi Arabia is more interesting. If, in my mind, a much bigger threat to proliferation besides the motivation side, because forget regional influence, they have a direct threat. But the real interesting thing here about Saudi Arabia is that, if we're talking about bank runs and bank failure, so AIG, which is a large insurance company, in 2008, when it was going to go under, the US government declared it was too big to fail. Saudi Arabia is the same way. In other words, it can't be sanctioned. It can't be sanctioned. First of all, Saudi Arabia is what allows you to sanction Iran. If you were to cut Saudi Arabia out from the oil export business, then you would be unable to simultaneously sanction Iran. Second of all, on its own, it's simply too big a part of the oil supply that you could cut them out. And for the same reason, of course, this may be good leverage for why they can be pretty convinced that the Americans will come to their aid. But at the same time, it means they have a certain level of invulnerability to international pressure. And that, in my mind, is very worrisome. To conclude, if Middle East actors believe that the U.S. is resolute in imposing severe costs on proliferators and resolute in guaranteeing the security for those who abide by their agreements despite facing potential proliferants, I believe it's highly unlikely that you'll find a full-fledged bank run on the NPT. However, as the UN resolve is questioned, you're more likely to see at least partial bank runs. In other words, you could see more countries, and this is what I think would be the most likely outcome, countries aiming for profiles like Japan and Germany, maybe even Iran, where you'd gain enough know-how and material to have a quick nuclear breakout capacity, but without being totally thrown into diplomatic isolation, diplomatic and economic isolation. In other words, without paying those extraordinary costs. And as I'm sure you have probably been told before, they would be able to have their yellow cake and eat it too. So, thank you.